welcome to Continuing the Conversation with Sadie, the space where we slow down, look beneath the surface, and explore the systems, structures, and human stories that shape care, leadership, and the way we live and work. In Series 3, we're looking closely at leadership and systems, not in theory, but in the real world. The world where decisions land in people's lives, where integration, reform, and joined up working aren't policy slogans, but daily realities that determine whether people feel supported, safe, and seen. Today, I'm joined by someone whose work has shaped the way the UK thinks about health and social care reform for more than 2 decades. Professor Jon Glasby is a national leader in health and social care, former director of the Health Services Management Centre, author of some of the most influential texts on integration and adult social care, and a long-standing advocate for evidence-based policy that actually reflects the lived realities of people and communities. His work has helped leaders, practitioners, and policymakers understand not just what needs to change, but why systems behave the way they do, and what it really takes to create something better. Jon is known for bringing clarity to complexity, for challenging assumptions that have gone unexamined for far too long, and for reminding us that behind every policy debate is a person, a family, a community. Jon, I am really glad to have you here with Series 3, which is all about origins, integration, and challenging the system. I just want to know, you've spent much of your career helping the system understand itself, its history, its patterns, its blind spots. What first drew you into this work, and when did you realise that the way we think about integration and reform needed a fundamentally different approach?
Thanks for the invite to be involved, Sadie, and thanks for a kind introduction. I almost didn't recognise myself from your description. So perhaps unusually, I did a history degree originally and then got the chance to train as a social worker and worked as a care worker while I was training. I later got the chance to do a PhD and move into research and policy work. I've always had an interest in the reality of people's lives, frontline practice, and what we can do to make a positive difference.
Yeah.
I thought my history was a distraction to start off with. And when I look back, I wonder whether some of my writing and some of our policy advice almost subconsciously starts with an understanding of where we've come from,
Yes.
try and understand where we are now and where we might be able to head next. So it does feel as if that kind of original training or that leaning as a kind of historian might be lurking in the background somewhere, even if I don't always realise it. I think my kind of attraction to some of the work that we do is that desire to make a difference, but maybe with my history and my social work, but both influencing some of that policy work more than I always realise.
So when you were answering the question, I was just thinking about generational care and how important it is to understand that. I work with the elderly, who their experience of their childhood is very different to how I describe mine.
Most of my work when I was a practitioner was with older people. I was also really struck by the kind of ageism that people experience. Early on, I was kind of academic, and someone said, when you're thinking about what to do, don't be a social worker. And if you are a social worker, don't be a social worker with older people. There was something in me that thought, if I did nothing else, I'm going to be a social worker. I'm going to be a social worker with older people, just to spite you for that attitude. And I've never regretted it, never once regretted it.
No, me neither. They're definitely my age group I've always stuck with. I love that take using your history degree. Your work is grounded in evidence, but also in a deep understanding of people's lived experience. Was there a moment or a pattern you kept seeing that made you think, we're not learning the right lessons here and something has to shift?
Yeah, so when I was training as a social worker, one of my in-depth was a 6-month placement in a social services area office in a city part of Birmingham where I live. It was obvious from the people I met that the kind of systems and services we got and the sort of professions that we got just didn't match the reality of people's lives. Were living complicated lives. Real life was more complex and messy than the approaches we create in our organisational charts and welfare systems. Single agency, single professional ways of working were never going to match the richness and complexity of people's lives. Early on, I didn't have the language of integrated care, but it was obvious that we had to join stuff up. Otherwise, it was going to make a difference to people. Now, that's a long time ago, and policies caught up in some respects, but it was obvious that we'd have to do stuff together because doing it separately was never going to work.
Policies can catch up, but it's the people and the way they apply those policies, isn't it? That's the other side to it. It's funny, you said something that has come through from other experts, especially people working together, the complexities that people aren't just a number, they're a person. And that's really good to hear. That's something that you're all saying. There is a level of agreement there from a very high level of expertise and experts.
The other thing that was really interesting about that experience is they were really rich, diverse communities. They were quite poor communities and struggling with quite a lot of kind of social problems. So much going on, close-knit communities, massive faith communities, diverse in ethnicity and faith, big voluntary sector, loads of community self-help and response. I learned loads from the communities I was meant to be supporting, and I got more from them than perhaps they ever got from me. So it was just a really rich, creative, exciting, formative experience, really. It was brilliant.
And that's why you're so aligned with this podcast, because we're about community, real lives, human side of care, and it's so important. So that's brilliant. Thank you. You've worked across academia, policy, local government, and national reform programs. How has your understanding of integration evolved as the landscape has changed and as the system has cycled through repeated attempts to fix the same problems?
Yeah, so I think over time, what struck me most is how similar some of the policy responses are, how cyclical our interest is in. The same stuff comes round and round, and you sit still long enough, it comes back round again. And often policymakers will be quite new, and some of the people supporting them will be quite new, and they'll propose something. And it'll look really similar to something that we tried before that they perceive not to have worked then. And so one of the questions we always ask is, if you want to achieve that now, why do you think what you're currently arguing for will work? If your diagnosis is the previous version didn't work, what's different this? And I wonder whether policy too often starts with a sort of top-down attempt to come up with a solution and then to impose it, other than something that's more bottom-up and alongside people and the reality of their lives.
Yeah.
And that starts bottom up and works out what's possible rather than starts top down and tries to impose it. Otherwise, we'll carry on going round that cycle of the same thing over and again. And I think people say Einstein's meant to have defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And I think George Bernard Shaw's meant to have said, anything we learn from history is you never learn anything from history. There's something about breaking that cycle and it differently. Otherwise, we'll just have the same results.
I hope everyone's just heard every word of what you've just said, because that was just bang on point, that answer, and something, if you're experienced in social care at whatever level, they will understand what you've just said, seeing the same thing rehashed out and never learning from the past. But yeah, like you said, this is coming from Professor Jon Glasby. You're often described as someone who brings clarity and honesty into spaces that can be quite defensive or politically charged. How do you see your role in the wider movement for more intelligent human systems leadership?
That's a really kind description of what we do. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I think there's probably two things that seem to really make a difference. The first is being really focused on outcome. Can we get the different people to agree what it is that we're trying to achieve?
Common theme coming from a lot of experts in Series 3.
Yeah. And then we can have a more meaningful conversation about what might you do, what might it look like, who might do it, how could you organise it, how would you fund it, what's needed. But unless you've got that prior sense of what success would look like, it's really hard to bring people together to have those conversations. And those conversations are more powerful when it's focused on the lives that people want to lead, and that we then work out what's needed in order to help people achieve that. Lots of policy debates start with discussions about processes and about structures. You lose sight of the wood for the trees. There's no real sense of what success would look like, so it's quite hard to ever resolve the debate. And then the second thing I think that's really important is empathy, and it's all playing a role as a critical friend to the social care and the health systems. Because we're independent, and because the conversations we're involved in are often quite confidential, maybe we're able to support people who are trying to make difficult decisions, but also challenge them while If you're a critical friend, that involves first and foremost being a friend, understanding the system, wanting it to do well, knowing why it matters, knowing why it's difficult, but also being able to challenge and to scrutinise and to critique. But with the people you're doing that with, knowing that's coming from a good place, that you're trying to help, you're not just criticising, you're trying to challenge in order to try and help them make a better decision or a decision that's more likely to be successful. So that role as a critical friend to the system is, I often find, is appreciated. And sometimes senior colleagues are in quite lonely roles. They're responsible for difficult things. Everything they do feels wrong. There's not really many people they can talk to about it. And so sometimes having someone who's independent, who's part of the system but separate from it, is a stress relief or a safety valve system as well. So I do think being a critical friend has made a difference.
Very good point. And a strong support network. Section 2, I want to go into system reform, power and the human impact of disjointed care. Anyone who's experienced out there, whatever level of care you're at, will relate to this. Clarity is a form of compassion. Making things easier for people to access is a form of compassion. So can't wait to get stuck into this with you, Jon. You've been clear that integration isn't a structural diagram or a reorganization. It's a way of working. What do you wish leaders understood about the real meaning of integration?
I definitely agree with that diagnosis. One of my close friends, Clinton Farquharson, a well-known disability rights campaigner, advocate of social justice, we were at a conference around integrated care, an international event that we brought to Birmingham recently. And I was interviewing Clinton, and he said to me, integrated care isn't something that happens in conferences or in policy documents. It happens in people's living rooms. You know whether or not stuff's integrated because of how it feels if you're on the receiving end of it. And that's always the acid test of whether something's working in reality or not. If something doesn't feel joined up, then it probably isn't. I guess policy is often focused on trying to create integrated structures or integrated systems. And that can be part of a solution, but there's two things that I always think are more important. The first is the outcomes that we're trying to deliver, as we talked about earlier, rooted in people's lives and communities. And then you can have a debate about what kind of processes and systems and organisations do you need to achieve those outcomes. And then secondly, a lot of this is bringing health and social care professions together to work with each other and to learn from and to share with each other. A lot of it is about how you work with organisational and professional cultures, and people are really passionate about their professions.
Yeah.
It's part of how they define themselves.
Absolutely.
And so being able to bring the best of that together to work out what you each do in an interprofessional, inter-organisational setting is important, but also quite difficult work. The policy layer will often focus on structures and organisations, whilst what actually makes it work is the outcomes you're trying to achieve, but then the way you work with the different kind of cultures to make that reality on the ground.
Home carers, because a lot of them don't realise they have really high levels of interpersonal skills, and that is essential for integration because you're able to communicate to people of all cultures, from all backgrounds.
You're providing direct care to people. It's at the front line. And there's also a key role. Some of the work that we've been involved in previously, it's often been the person, the family, and the care worker who know the person best, who are well placed to spot changes in somebody or changes in their routine that might be an indication of a health problem developing or deterioration, and having the confidence to say, I know this person and I'm an advocate alongside the person, and to advocate with other health and social care professions is a really important role as well. And we've seen that, for example, with people with learning disabilities with health conditions, where it's the person, it's the family, it's the care worker who are saying to the hospital, there's something wrong here, you need to investigate. Definitely.
That's a good example of integration and how complicated it is, which is why it's a key topic for Series 3. You often talk about the gap between being involved and having influence in the context of system reform. What does genuine shared power look like between organisations, between professionals, and crucially with people and communities? We're talking about power imbalances.
For me, this is about co-production, the kind of buzzword that gets used a lot, but it gets used to mean almost any kind of engagement or collaboration. It gets used so much that it loses its power and its original meaning. People sometimes involve others because they feel they have to, or as a way of going through the motions, or they do it anyway, even if it can't really make a difference to the decision being made. There's no point asking a question if you're not really interested in the answer. I've always felt, as you were suggesting, Sadie, this is more about power sharing and about genuine co-production. And that always feels to me like a journey that we go on together.
Yes.
You probably don't know the destination yet. I'm sure you never reach a destination, but it's about taking some of the journey together. And so it's about time, and it's about relationships, and about learning from and with each other as you go, and about trying to make progress together. And that seems a better sense of involvement and engagement and co-production than some of the jargon and some of the buzzwords, which kind of sound good or read well on paper, but perhaps aren't full that they might be. Certainly when I talk to people who draw on care and support, when I talk to families, when I talk to frontline staff, they're fairly sick of attempted involvement that feel tokenistic rather than real genuine. Some of that is about honesty. So sometimes there's only so much that's possible. Being honest about the nature of the conversation and the parameters of what's possible. Sometimes we shy away from that honesty, whilst most people I've met are realistic about what is and isn't possible, and they understand there's limits. They just want to be part of a solution.
And also it's about emotional intelligence, especially in leadership. And that's related to that. If you go back to series 1, we'll explain in more depth about emotional intelligence and self-awareness and all these things that are the foundation to what we do today. So that's really interesting. Many of our listeners work in care, health, or community services where relationships are everything. What happens emotionally when systems are designed around organisational boundaries rather than people's lives?
Yeah, people who draw on care and support, families, staff, see through it instantly if it's not real and it's not genuine. It's hard to be clear what we mean by integration. It's one of those words that means different things to different people, but you sort of know it when you see it, and you can tell when things aren't joined up. And when they're not joined up, people don't get their needs met. They get past pillar to post. They fall through the gaps of the system. Staff waste precious time and energy. They get dispirited and worn out. There's duplications. Things feel deeply dispiriting. And in extreme cases, when things that need to be joined up aren't joined up, people die. Lives are blighted and even ended. Unintegrated care just doesn't work.
It's when you see things happen and you think this could have been prevented. It's failure of a system when it gets to that level. And if it could have been prevented, it's awful for everybody. But yeah, I would say to anyone listening, if you're stuck in a system and things are not working for you, get help sooner rather than later. And I'm sure you would support me on that, Jon.
Definitely. And there's also a really interesting model about why major things go wrong in systems. I think it's a guy called James Reason, and he's got this Swiss cheese model, which I really like because it's really memorable. And I also quite like cheese.
Yeah.
And it's the idea of organizations or systems have got protective layers to stop bad things from happening, like these slices of cheese move constantly backwards and forwards, and the holes in the cheese constantly open up and close down. And when a potential for something bad to happen comes along, it might get through a couple of holes in the cheese, and sooner or later it hits something that's cheese rather than whole, and the bad thing doesn't happen. And then in really bad situations, the post office scandal is a really good example. Everything is fine so that the bad thing comes along and it gets through hole after hole after hole, and then the bad thing happens. And that's true of child deaths and mental health homicides and all the horrific things that listeners will have been involved in or read about both. But this idea of that Swiss cheese model makes you think about the kind of system a little bit more. And he has a second analogy where he said often we try and prevent those kind of things by stopping individual bad things from happening, like trying to stop malaria by swatting individual mosquitoes. And sooner or later you miss one and the mosquito gets through and you get bit. You said the better way of doing it is to drain the swamp in the first place, and that gets rid of all the mosquitoes. So there's just some analogies that make it a bit more visual when you're thinking about these things.
Do you have any books that you would recommend that my listeners could read that would support that? Because that sounds really interesting.
Not been better read. I've got a feeling I read it in an article. If you looked up James Reason and Swiss cheese model, you'd find it on Google. It might be free to access. You'll find it out there. It's quite common. And I just found it just made me see it in really simple ways. So I quite enjoyed it because I think kind of simple's better, really. And it just helped me conceptualize it, really. Apologies if I've got that wrong and it's behind a paywall, but I think you can find it fairly easily. Reason as in Reason, James Reason. If you add Swiss cheese, you'll probably find it.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. I love that. Yeah, thank you. You've seen the human cost of fragmented systems and the transformation that happens when care is coordinated, relational, and person centered. What patterns do you see in how individuals and communities cope, resist, or thrive depending on the system around them?
I'm fortunate enough to run a centre now called Impact, the UK Centre for Getting Evidence Used in Adult Social Care Practice. We work all over the UK supporting people to use evidence to make a difference. But as part of that work, I've had the privilege of meeting people in local communities and local services all over the country who are doing brilliant things, supporting each other and introducing changes. They're often small scale, it's often quiet, it's under the radar and bottom up. It's often in spite of some of our systems rather than because of them. And if solutions aren't going to come nationally, and my sense of the policy context at the moment is they're probably not going to come nationally anytime soon, then we probably have to focus on creating our own solutions.
Yes.
Bottom up. So that's about that kind of everyday innovation that listeners to the podcast will be doing in the relationships they build and the care they deliver. So I think it's bottom up and I think it's everyday rather than dramatic and kind of top down. Just to give you one example from the lots of different projects we run, we worked with a group of people with learning disabilities in Swansea called Friends United Together. They were worried the local authority was going to change how their care was delivered and that they were going to get split up. So they chose to receive a direct payment. It pulled the direct payment and formed a user-led cooperative so they could commission their own care and support from a really innovative support agency and stay together as a group of friends. And they got support from a co-op development agency, and co-ops are quite big in Wales. And now it's absolutely brilliant. And it's one of those everyday innovations that anybody could have done. It would just never have crossed my mind to do that because I don't think about the world in those kind of terms. And all that they needed was a bit of support to run with this idea as to how they could stay together as a group of friends. So really simple, really powerful. Happened kind of in spite of some of our systems rather than because of it, as I've said. Now the local authority are really passionate about it. They're keen to share this innovation. The friends are passionate about it. It's fantastic. But it starts with people, with relationships, with going about things differently and then working from there.
And again, it's about taking risks, being vulnerable and giving it a go, which reinforces our conversation earlier about power sharing. Yeah, that's amazing. We're going to go into section 3 about leadership, evidence, and a better way forward. So first of all, if you could redesign one aspect of how leaders think about integration and adult social care tomorrow, where would you start?
So I'd start with the lives that people want to lead and the natural supports that we all draw on in our own communities to lead our own lives, and then think of ways that public services and that care and support can bolster and boost some of that or can wrap around it, other than the traditional approach where we've ignored that kind of stuff and sometimes we've even ridden roughshod over it. It starts with the lives that we want to lead together and then leads to a more creative conversation about what we can all do to get closer to those chosen lives.
Basically ground up again, asking the people that are living it and lived experiences. Fantastic. You work with leaders who genuinely want to shift culture and others who stay stuck in old patterns, are stuck in a rut. What distinguishes the leaders who move towards meaningful reform from those who remain in performative change?
I suppose different things are sometimes possible at different moments in time. So you might have people who want it, but it's kind of really difficult. It's quite easy to get bogged down. So there's something about doing what's possible at any given time without blame or judgment. But you have to believe that things can be better and be curious and empathetic, a sense of what success would look like. You have to be open and collaborative. No one can do all this on their own. And you've got to be really creative, really flexible, really resilient, and, not take no for an answer. You have to keep on keeping on.
It's lovely to hear your point of view on it, and your knowledge and experience all comes into that. There's a growing appetite for change, but also fear of getting it wrong, fear of losing control, fear of slowing things down. What would you say to leaders who know the current system isn't working, but feel overwhelmed by the scale of change?
So the centre that I run, Impact, is a centre that tries to get evidence used in practice. And people talk about the importance of policy and practice being evidence-based. And obviously working in a university, I'd fundamentally agree with that. But sometimes people use it in a defensive way. They say, "Give me the evidence that this is going to work before I do it." And it's an excuse not to do something or a reason to say no. We sometimes turn that round and say, we've got loads of evidence of things that don't work. So why don't we start there and see if we can come up with a better way of doing it? And then we could give it a go and learning and reflecting. It's almost a form of practice-based evidence rather than traditional evidence-based practice. When you turn it round, that opens things up and makes them feel more possible and more doable for people and helps them get beyond that fear and stuckness, maybe starting with what you know doesn't work and trying to make it better, rather than taking a leap with a set of stuff that you've inherited before you know that it's going to make a difference.
Wish I had a mentor like you in my life about 20 years ago, because he'd flipped that narrative and he got it spot on, because it's about reflective practice and seeing it in an optimistic light, not in a negative, and understanding what evidence means. It's not just written, it's what works in people's lives. Thank you. Looking ahead, what gives you hope that integration, evidence-based policy and person-centered systems can become the norm?
Well, there's some great people out there doing great things, hidden, not getting the recognition that they deserve, but doing it nonetheless in spite of all the challenges. So I am fundamentally optimistic. And when I look back, loads of things have changed. A lot of the things are unrecognisable from the services and the settings I saw when I was training. I do think we've made progress and that we'll continue progress. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but we're still making progress. So we are improving things. It's just that public opinion constantly accelerates. The more things improve, the more we take them for granted and want them to be even better as a society. In one sense, you become a victim of your own success, always running to stand still or playing catch up. And that's the nature of care and support and public service. It's a good thing because however tough today was, it makes you want to come in and do even better. That's the nature of both the challenge and the opportunity that we face. It's quite a difficult policy and practice context right now, but I'm also really optimistic in our ability to carry on making progress together.
We're going to come away from the questions and do Beyond the Bio, a special section for people I want to know more about as a person. So here we go. So for Beyond the Bio, I want to know what's something people would never guess about you from your job titles or public work.
We talked about having fun. I'm not sure academics believe in having fun.
Oh, come on.
So unusually, I was a drummer in a rock band.
Oh, wow.
I was a drummer in a band at school, and then we stayed in touch over the years, and I was a drummer again in a similar band many years later and still try and play a little bit when I can. I'm not a very good drummer, and several of the bands weren't very good either, but they were fun, and I just really enjoyed it.
That's great. I love that. Did you have a band name?
So one of them was called Cabrini Green, the big housing project on the edge of Chicago before it got knocked down. If you've seen the horror film The Candyman, that's based on Cabrini Green back in the day as well. So slight kind of nerdy rock music / housing project crossover, but that was one of the names.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Okay, next one. Are you ready?
Yeah, go for it.
What's a joy, hobby, or ritual that keeps you grounded when the work gets heavy?
I really like playing football. I'm probably a worse footballer than I am a drummer, actually, as well. So I'm not actually very good, but I've really enjoyed it and it keeps me fit and it's a team element of it. The game I play is, there's a group of people about my age, but then also a group of their kids who are all kind of undergraduates. It's all the age ranges, trying to keep up with the youngsters and hold my own with people who are fitter and a lot better than I am. Is quite a good workout. I tell people that I gave up a promising footballing career in order to be an academic, but that's not entirely true. This is a more worky answer, but it's genuine. Early on in my career, I got appointed to the board of the Social Care Institute for Excellence, SCI, which tries to identify what works in social care and then get it disseminated. And the chair was a woman called Jane Campbell, who had been a lifelong disability rights campaigner. She'd been involved in campaigning for the Disability Discrimination Act, developing direct payments. She went on to be a Disability Rights Commissioner. She's now an independent peer in the House of Lords. Jane had always been a lifelong heroine of mine, and she was values-driven and passionate about social justice. and a powerful advocate, but she was good at bringing people from very different backgrounds together to talk about these kind of things. She built coalitions and partnerships. And even when I didn't know something that I should have known, she never made me feel stupid. She made me want to learn more and to develop. And so some people can say quite difficult things, but they say it in a way that drives the other person away and in a kind of confrontational way. Jane can be a fierce advocate for what's right, but do it in a way that you can hear, that makes you want to engage, that brings you closer, that makes you feel part of something. I just think that's a real skill. So
it is.
I've always been Jane's just a heroine of mine.
That's lovely that you remember and mention her and talk about her with such respect. That's brilliant. I love that. We've all got somebody, haven't we?
Definitely.
What's a lesson you learned the hard way that still guides you now? Can you admit it?
Wow. So I'd finished my history degree and I wondered about doing a history PhD or about trying to train as a social worker. I've been doing a lot of voluntary experience through the university, running a day centre for older people, volunteering at Erasmus project, running a holiday for disabled older people and so on, but as a student volunteer. I applied for the social work programme and you had to do a personal statement. And I remember saying somewhere in there, I want to be a social worker because I want to help people. And then I snuck onto the course by the skin of my teeth. I think someone probably dropped out and I was on a reserve list. I remember chatting to the social work prof afterwards who said, yes, John, I've read your personal statement. You said you wanted to be a social worker because you wanted to help people. I said, yeah. And she said, that's lovely, John. I think you might find it's a bit more complicated than that. I thought it was a really gentle way of saying, in one sense, lovely, John, but you may find that's a little naive. During the course of the programme, yes, it's about helping people, but there is a bit more to it than that, as of course we all know in the realities of the jobs that we all do. But I've always remembered that. I think you might find it's a little more complex than that, John, which was probably quite a subtle way of just saying I had a lot to learn.
But if after all this time you can still say it's because I want to help people, you know you've done the right thing.
I think my heart was in the right place, but she probably was right that I did have a bit to learn to harness that.
I think we've all got some funny stories from a careers advisor in our generation. And finally, what's one thing you wish every leader understood about systems, people, or the realities of change?
I think you've got to experience it for yourself, or you've got to be alongside people who are experiencing it so that you better understand it. People who draw on care and support and unpaid carers and people working in frontline services. And you've probably got to ask, is this good enough? Is it good enough for me and good enough for my family? And actually, if it isn't, and it's not good enough, we've got to find a way of trying to do it better. That's easy to say and difficult to do in the reality of our services. But I think that kind of reality check is what makes the difference, really.
I think from your answer, I'm definitely hearing that if the system allows for human connection, it's going to go in the right direction, however that system works or wherever you are or whatever sort of thing. John, thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed Beyond Bio. I now know I was talking to not just a professor, an ex-band member, and
a promising football career he gave up for the sake of academia.
How important it is to have hobbies, not just work. I just wanted to thank you, and what you've shared reminds us that integration isn't a structural reform, it's a mindset. It's a way of leading that honours people's lives, stories and expertise. You've shown us that system reform isn't about reorganising boxes on a chart. It's about relationships, trust and the courage to learn from evidence and experience. Your work challenges us to move beyond the rhetoric, beyond short-term fixes, and beyond the illusion that change can be achieved without shifting power, culture, and assumptions. For those listening, I invite you to reflect. Where in your own work do you see fragmentation and where could connections be strengthened? What would it look like to design systems around people's lives rather than organisational boundaries? This has been Continuing the Conversation with Sadie. Until next time, take gentle care of yourselves, of each other, and of the communities you're part of, so you can keep reflecting, caring, and growing. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Sadie.